Welcome Cory and Rebecca, and thank you for joining us.
We have just a tiny little video to set
Creators
us
aren't
up.
getting paid. That's because powerful corporations have figured out how to create choke points that let them snatch up most of the value generated by creative work before it reaches creative workers. I'm Cory Doctorow.
And I'm Rebecca Giblin.
Our new book, Choke Point Capitalism, pulls aside the veil on the tricks big tech and big content use to lock in users and suppliers, eliminate competition, and ultimately shake down creators and producers.
We also share tons of ideas for how we can recapture creative labour markets to make them fairer and more sustainable. Margaret Atwood says, we tell how the vampires crashed the party and provide protective garlic. But don't take her word for it. Check out our extended video or read the book for more.
I love starting with that because our producer Greta did such a beautiful job of drawing Margaret Atwood. And also I'm so excited that Margaret Atwood knows my name. That's not supposed to happen. Hi everyone, it is so fantastic to be back here. Thank you so much to the ADA who made our trip here possible, made it possible for for Cory to come to Australia, not Australia to come to Cory. That would have been logistically far more difficult. This is, and thanks also to Sarah and Elliot for all of their enormous work in putting this event together, and also to Derek for his continued efforts to make things better in copyright policy and corral all of us into some semblance of order. This is my first time in Canberra since the 6th of March 2020. So who else was in the room then? We were all like, yeah, we were bumping elbows. I remember like Nick Souza didn't make it at all because like his university cancelled all travel like when he was on the way to the airport, which we all thought was like maybe a bit of an overreaction. And then life was cancelled. The place really seems to have changed since I was here last. I mean, that's the dessert they gave me last night. Canberra, are you okay? Okay, so life was cancelled. I was locked in my apartment, and so in one sense, prison, but in another sense, I felt really free. Because there was a whole slate of work I'd promised for that year and even the years after some of it I'd promised years earlier, but I was released from the obligation to do that. And in fact, it was impossible to do that because a lot of it was field work in New York. But I had the opportunity to decide which story I really needed to tell. And it was instantaneous, I knew. Just in the weeks preceding this, I'd read the most incredible book on monopsony by an expert called Peter Carstensen, and it crystallized so many things I'd been grasping towards for years. Now, monopsony, it's the inverse of monopoly. We all know about monopoly because of the family-destroying board game. It's where you've got a seller that's got lots of power over buyers. Monopsony is the inverse. It's where you've got really powerful buyers. And so anyone who tries to work in food production, manufacturing in Australia knows all about that because of their relationships with the supermarket duopoly. But also Amazon is a really powerful buyer in its dealings with publishers and authors, the big three record labels who own the big three music publishers in their dealings with recording artists and composers, and many more throughout the culture industries. Apple and Facebook and Google, all really powerful buyers. And I realized I needed to tell the story of how big business had captured creative labor markets, and particularly how their roles as big buyers were distorting markets, were turning them into these hourglass shapes that had creators at one end and audiences at the other, and themselves squatting at the neck where they could use their ability to mediate access to shake everybody down until the value that went to creators was reaching an unsustainably low share. All right, but while the word was new, right, the idea wasn't. The idea for this book was born in a taxi ride with this guy 2 years earlier. We were in Melbourne, and we were just sort of united in shared despair about how dumb the copyright discourse was. That we were locked in these seemingly unending battles and arguments that just didn't move forward. We were constantly told we have to choose between big tech or big content. Right? Arguments for evidence-based copyright policies like flexible exceptions led to me and many others in this room told that we hate artists and want them to starve. We were in despair because we knew that whoever won, whether it was big tech or big content, the best you could hope for was crumbs from the table. And we wanted more than that. So when the world ended, this is the story I started work on. I worked on it for a few weeks, and it was the most exhilarating but frustrating thing. It was so hard to argue with myself in a locked apartment. And at some point I was like, this book would be better if Cory Doctorow wrote it with me. So something you might not know is that you can just email him and say, Cory, would you write a book with me? And he'll say yes. He hates it when I say this because don't do that. Please don't do that. But it turns out he writes when he's anxious. He's got 7 more books coming out. And he did say yes, and this was my lifeline to the outside world during lockdown. So this false dichotomy, this insistence that we have to choose between big tech or big content causes an enormous amount of harm. It polarizes groups that should be allies, like authors and libraries, artists and galleries and museums. Picking sides also means that people can't or won't listen to the evidence. Right? That means a lot of wasted work, a lot of wasted resources, and a discourse that just crawls forward with painful slowness. So yes, the hard work that we've all poured in for so many years, and especially the persistent, patient, quiet advocacy of the ADA have meant that we've got some progress in the right direction, right? And we should celebrate that, the fact that exceptions are now a bit better for cultural organizations and people with disabilities. It is great that we fix some of the inadequacies of the inappropriately drafted safe harbor law, but still, that false dichotomy, and particularly the power and influence that is bought by big business, which takes the extra money it gets from shaking down creators and puts it into lobbying efforts to confuse and distort these debates, means this has been so much slower and more resource intensive and more adversarial than it needs to be. It can make it really hard to keep fighting. And I can see there are some people not in this room today because they've had to stop. Because at some point you don't have any more to give. And I want to acknowledge those people and all that they've given and how it has helped us achieve those victories. I remember a few years ago when somebody asked me what I do. I think it must have been a particularly bad week, and I said, I scream into the void. Okay, but what I think is perhaps the most significant cost and what I really want to emphasize today is the way that this dichotomy keeps artists and authors and performers and museums and libraries and galleries and schools and universities fighting each other for scraps. Right? We're fighting for those crumbs from the table, and it distracts us from looking up and saying, why should those guys get the whole loaf? So we need to recognize that we are class allies. Right? We've got far more commonality than difference. And we need to ask, how does that help us move forward? Like as the government says, okay, let's go back into this, how do we make it so that the outcome, the process and the outcome are different in tone and in substance than the ones that we've had before? Because all of us have a shared mission. We care so much about making the world a better and more beautiful place, a fairer and more equitable place. And in pursuit of that mission, whether we're a creator or whether we work in a cultural institution or we work in a school or a university, we're sometimes obliged to work with or within organizations that weaponize our passion to facilitate our exploitation. Sometimes it's external funding pressures that force that, which again is a trickle down from the overall economic systems, the operating system of our society. Sometimes it's because the surplus of our labor is being delivered directly into investor pockets. But the cause is the same, that we are working within economic systems structured to make rich people richer at everybody else's expense. So say what you like about capitalism, but competition is supposed to be fundamental to it. So many of the richest people on the planet, though, have achieved their wealth by systematically eliminating it. You know, we're told not to worry about increased market concentration because if somebody gets powerful, that's just a temporary market advantage. It will attract new entrants. It will be competed away. Fantastic. But these people have worked out so many clever ways of ensuring that those temporary advantages get cemented in to lock us all in. And they've got really brazen about it too. Like Peter Thiel comes out and is like, competition is for losers, right? The orthodoxy taught in business schools now is don't make a thing that people need or provide a service that they want. That's only going to get you regular rich. If you want to get dumb rich, and they all want to get dumb rich, right? Find a way to get between the people that make and do and capture the value of their labor. Create an enduring choke point that allows you to do that. So while we were researching this book, we realized that they were all working from the same playbook, right? And it's one that was popularized by Amazon, which is so proud of it that like they boast about it, they turned it into a diagram where they call it this virtuous cycle. But it's not a virtuous cycle, it's a vicious one. And we made another little video to show what's really going on.
Here's how Amazon describes its flywheel. Lower costs lead to lower prices, which create better customer experiences, translating to more traffic, which then attracts more sellers and thus a better selection. That improves the experience even more, and the cycle continues. Amazon calls this a virtuous cycle, but it's not virtuous. It's anti-competitive. Here's what's really going on. Amazon's strategy has always been to lock in its customers. One way it does this is by putting digital rights management on ebooks and audiobooks, which cements readers to Kindle and Audible. Another is by offering fast, free shipping to Prime members. Once you pay your annual fee, Amazon becomes your default whenever you need to buy something.
Locking in its customers lets Amazon lock in its suppliers too. Publishers and small businesses can't afford to give up access to Amazon's increasingly large share of the market, so they keep listing their goods there, even when that's bad for their business long term. Amazon's lower cost structure is just a euphemism for shaking down its suppliers and workers. Amazon uses its market power to demand steep discounts and high fees from those other businesses as a cost of selling on its platform. It uses that money to subsidize low prices, which has the effect of eliminating competitors who actually pay fairly. As time goes on, that means Amazon suppliers have even less choice. Those low prices also lure more customers, who then get locked into Amazon's platform as well. The shakedown grows more merciless and damaging as Amazon's flywheel spins faster and gains ever more momentum.
Okay, so all kinds of techniques that are used there to lock people in. I'm going to now hand over to Cory, right? We're going to talk just a tiny little bit. No, we're not. Definitely not having morning tea yet. Don't go anywhere. We've got more stuff to say. We're going to say a little bit more about why things are shit. But then, after that, the whole rest is talking about what we can do to make it better. Cory, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rebecca. It is an absolute pleasure to be back in Australia and in Canberra for the first time. So as you listen to us describe these problems of choke points, you may be asking yourself, how are these choke points different from normal intermediaries? It's not as though the arts was normally a direct business. I grew up in Toronto. We're the cold Australians. And there was a guy who was quite infamous in Toronto who went by the pen name Crad Kolodny. And Crad used to write his own fiction and publish it in his own chapbooks that he would himself assemble. And then he would stand on busy streets with a sign around his neck that said, "Very famous Canadian author, buy my books." Or sometimes one that just said, Margaret Atwood. They actually, in the documentary about his life, got Margaret to stand on a street corner with a sign around her neck that said, "Famous Canadian author, buy my books." So intermediaries are fine. We don't all have to be Crad Kolodny. I am myself, excuse me, a recovering library worker, bookseller, and publisher. Nothing wrong with the idea that an author doesn't have to do it all in order to reach their audience. But choke point capitalism is a different kind of intermediary, an intermediary that's endemic to platforms under monopoly conditions. For the past 40 years, we've had lax regulation that has permitted all kinds of anti-competitive conduct, primarily things like mergers to monopoly, anti-competitive catch and kill acquisitions, vertical monopoly creation, and predatory pricing. We all remember those golden years when Uber was willing to spend Saudi royal money to lose 41 cents on every dollar they brought in and put all the cab companies out of business by giving us cheap rides. If you've gotten in an Uber lately, you know that the party is over. So this arises, this dynamic that arises on platforms comes from the digital nature of platforms. If you want to change how you're charging or how much you're paying, and you run a grocery store where every item is tagged with a little adhesive label, and you decide you want to change the price, you're going to have to pay an army of teenagers to run around and put new adhesive labels on it. But when you're running a digital service, you've just got these sliders you move around, and you can shift all kinds of things about how the surpluses are allocated within your business. And the choke point capitalism playbook is one in which platforms play a kind of shell game with those surpluses. Surpluses being, the thing that's left over after you've paid all your expenses. So in the beginning, these firms, they like to allocate their surpluses to users. It's a way of bringing in users. You can think of Amazon when they started, they subsidized shipping. They actually subsidized prices. They sold a lot of goods for less than they actually paid for them. It's hard to resist that when you're a customer. Who wouldn't want to buy something for less than it costs to make it? They subsidized returns. And this brought in all kinds of users. And those users became a kind of honey trap for sellers who now saw that if they wanted to reach a market, they would have to offer their goods for sale on Amazon. And Amazon had all kinds of pot sweeteners for people who wanted to become platform sellers on Amazon's platform. If you were a Kindle author or an Audible author, they offered unbeatable royalty shares and incredibly square deals where if someone searched for your name, that would be the first thing that came up. They subsidized the cost of the hardware so that there were lots of people who had Kindle players that were able to read the ebooks that you were making with the platform. So it's also true for other sellers. If you were a seller, it was quite nice to be able to sell on a platform where Amazon would actually offset the costs and offer it to your customers for less. And if the customer wasn't happy, Amazon would eat the price of returning those goods and replacing them. You also, as a seller, got a really square deal, what I'm told is called fair dinkum, when you, in the search results, so that if you made a product that was a close match for something a customer was looking for, that would be the thing that would show up at the top of those search results, and you could close the sale. So once the customers are there and locked in, and they get locked in different ways on different platforms. If you're a social media platform, the customers lock themselves in. right? Once you've signed up for Facebook and then all your friends join to talk to you, you can't leave because they're there and they can't leave because you're there. It's a kind of mutual hostage taking, what the economists call the collective action problem. You're going to experience it tonight when you try to agree with your friends where to go for dinner, but doing that with everyone you know on a digital platform and trying to decide which platform to go to next and when you should leave is something so transcendentally hard that it happens once in a generation. And so you have users holding each other hostage there. And the Facebook users became an irresistible draw for Facebook publishers. And Facebook gave them a good deal, just like Amazon did. If you were a news publisher in the early days of news media gold rush on Facebook, all you had to do was post a couple of sentences from your article and a link back to your own website where you got to keep 100% of the ad revenue. And Facebook would make sure that it went into the feeds, not just of the people who subscribed to you, but people they thought might subscribe to you. Facebook allocates those surpluses to users, then they allocate it to publishers. In the case of Facebook, they took some surplus away from those users. You may remember that when Facebook started, it was only available to American college students. You had to have a .edu address, and then they decided to open it up to the rest of the world. And their pitch to the rest of the world was, stop using MySpace. It's owned by an evil, crepulent Australian billionaire who will steal your private data. And here on Facebook, we will never spy on you. Right? Once the users were there, it rated that surplus that those users were creating, ramped up surveillance, and allocated it to advertisers and said, here's a great way to target your ads. And it gave those advertisers a really square deal. You paid a reasonable price, your ads got shown to people. If Facebook told you your ad was shown to someone, it really was. And you generated a lot of sales off of that as well. Every platform, whether it's app stores on the mobile platforms, even Google Maps and its merchant platform to allow merchants to sell goods to people by paying and using the platform to make sure that they got priority when someone searched, every one of those followed this pattern. Once the users are locked in, and then the sellers are locked in, the firm running the platform can move the sliders around and reallocate the surplus to itself. If you're an Uber driver, you get paid less and the ride costs more. If you're an Amazon seller, the first 5 screens of results on Amazon are ads. And by ad, I mean just payola, right? If you're a seller on Amazon and you want your thing to be matched when someone searches for that specific model number, that specific product, Amazon will require you to bid against other people selling competing products. 50% of the first results are ads. Of the remainder, a significant fraction are products where Amazon has looked at the businesses of its platform sellers and cloned the most profitable products and then put them out of business. Today, more than 50% of every dollar raised by a third-party seller on Amazon is trousered by Amazon in some form of junk fee. And that ad business, which Amazon touts as the new market entrant to compete away the ad duopoly of Facebook and Google, is worth $31 billion, and almost all of it is just payola for search priority within Amazon. It used to be that people were going to Google to search Amazon. Amazon actually created a product to try and incentivize people not to search Amazon on Google and to search in the place where Amazon could extract revenue from it. They called it Amazon Smile. I don't know if it ran here, but in the US, if you were a registered charity or a sports team, a Little League team for kids, you could tell your stakeholders that if they began their search on the Amazon Smile page for your charity, that you would get a few pennies from every dollar they spent. This was really just a way for Amazon to lure people into doing all of their searching on Amazon so that they would endure the terrible search results that made Amazon so much money. This pattern replicates through Spotify. It replicates through any platform that is mature enough that the platform owner can start to reallocate surpluses to themselves. And I call it enshittification. It is not your imagination that everything is just getting worse, right? It's not that you're getting older. The internet really did used to be better. Google really did used to do its very best job to show you what it thought you wanted to see and not the things that were most profitable to it. Today, it's kind of a race to see who's worse at searching Amazon or Google. Killing Smile was just hastening the inevitable demise because Google is now also a cesspit of sponsored links and self-dealing to things that aren't what you're searching for there as well. So we see this playing out especially in arts markets. We see the royalty schemes being changed in Kindle and Audible. There's been a monotonic ratcheting down of the amount of money that a Kindle or Audible author gets. When Audible started its self-serve platform, it offered a very good deal to independent authors, and then it started to tighten the screws on that. For example, it said, if you finance your own audiobook and sell it on Audible's platform, that is to say you let Audible host the file on Amazon's cloud and move it around and collect payments for it, in exchange for that service, you had to agree to a 7-year exclusivity, which didn't allow you to sell it anywhere else. We document in our book a systematic form of wage theft on Audible. It was colloquially called Audiblegate, where Audible was hiding from sellers the way that it offered generous refunds policies to people who subscribed to Audible, who were locked into Audible's platform with a monthly recurring charge, where you could return a book for a credit, and what Audible wasn't telling the people it was exhorting to return the books for a new credit, to get another book, make that subscription more valuable, reduce the temptation to look somewhere else. What they didn't say was that they were clawing back the royalty from the author. And they accounted to those authors on a net basis, so the authors couldn't see it either. You saw that you sold 5 copies, but that was 5 net copies. And you didn't know if it had been 25 copies with 20 returns, which Amazon was encouraging by showing listeners pop-up ads and sending them emails about books that they'd bought a year before and listened to more than once to say, you know, you might be unsatisfied with this and you can return it for a credit. Amazon calls itself relentlessly customer-focused. They are relentlessly customer-focused when they can charge it off to someone else's account, and creators are among the most squeezable in that. So we see this in shitification proceeding today. ChatGPT and other, God, I hate this term, artificially intelligent text and image generators pose an enormous spam problem for Google. They can ramp up at speed the kind of anodyne garbage text that already dominates search results that are today written by low-waged workers on gig platforms, and they're going to be able to pump it out at mass scale and make those search results even worse. And rather than dedicating itself foursquare to fighting AI spam, Google has announced an all-hands project to convert search results to florid paragraphs written by their own chatbot, which will, like all chatbots, be a habitual liar that lies convincingly and doesn't know when it's lying. This is what firms do when they're interested in harvesting surpluses and they're undisciplined either by regulation or by competition, when they're too big to fail and too big to jail. And shitification is endemic to monopoly platform economics. It adversely affects every platform user. If you're on Facebook and you're an advertiser, it's come for you. If you're a publisher, it's come for you. If you're a user, it's come for you. If you're a performer or a creator, it's come for you. And this is what we mean when we say that all the platform users are class allies against the platform operator. And this is obviously true irrespective of whether the platform is owned by tech companies or entertainment companies. If you're a musician performing on YouTube, you're getting a raw deal. And if you're a musician performing on Spotify, you're getting a raw deal. A slightly different one, but no less raw, but Spotify is owned by labels and YouTube is owned by a tech giant. It doesn't matter, you know, spoiler alert for George Orwell, when you look from the pigs to the men and the men to the pigs at the end of Animal Farm, you won't be able to tell the difference. So we are all ill-served by choke point capitalism, and that's bad news, but the good news is that we're also all natural allies in this fight, and the sooner we realize it, the sooner we can get to work on smashing it. Back to you, Rebecca.
All right, so bunch of stuff on how shit everything is, but now something different, talking about how we make it better. And this was a really big focus of ours in writing this book. We were determined that it wasn't going to be yet another of those chapter 11 books, you know, 10 chapters about how terrible everything is, and then some hand-waving at the end, right? Don't have time to get into any proposals to solve it, which obviously is the much harder bit. And so we really wanted to do it differently, and our book is full of proposals. So how do we reverse these flywheels? And I should emphasize, and I think just drawing out on that point that Cory made, it's not just creative workers who are affected by choke points, and it's not just other people who are passionate about their work. You know, we're all just canaries in the coal mine. We keep getting We keep getting mentions on social media and emails from people. I think my favorite one is someone who works in like big, he said, this is exactly the same thing, thank you for naming this, it's exactly the same thing that's happening in my industry, which is the global market for ornamental plants. It's amazing, big plant is a thing. All right, so, and we've also seen, like for all of us, even if you're just like, well, my job is secure, like I'm not gonna be facing this, you are though, because we see that the way that these choke points allow the accumulation of capital that then gets used to pollute the political process and to buy influence. So what do we do about it? Well, we just heard from the AG about the fantastic news of a couple of weeks ago, Revive, the new national cultural policy. And a round of applause for Revive, because when I read that, I whooped in my office. I was so excited to see a reversal, and not just a reversal that changes the rhetoric, although the changed rhetoric is really important too, the fact that the government is recognizing arts work as real work, right? Absolutely vital. But the thing that's even more important, money, okay? And we see $286 million there over the next 5 years. But we also know there's already countless billions of dollars slashing around in the culture industries. So the real question is, how do we get that money into the right pockets? So for decades, what we've been doing is pulling the copyright lever. Okay, we're told, okay, artists aren't doing very well, let's give them more copyright. But that's like, without more, that's like giving your bullied kid more lunch money. Right? It doesn't matter how much lunch money you give them, the bullies are still going to shake them down for that at the school gate. That just means that there is more to take. And eventually, the bullies are going to have so much lunch money that they can afford to announce a nationwide campaign or run a nationwide campaign saying, won't somebody think of the hungry school children, give them more lunch money. And they'll take that too. All right. And so I was thinking about this analogy. We use this analogy a lot. And I was thinking about it this morning over breakfast. And I remembered one of the most exhilarating moments in my childhood. My brother and I we used to walk to and from school by ourselves. And one day we were followed home by a bully called Lumpy and his friends. Lumpy was terrifying, okay? I was really scared. And we ran home, we were just ahead of them. And then my brother opened the side gate of our house and outran our German Shepherd, Zach. Right? Zach was a lovely, kind, gentle dog. But not that day, right? He could feel the energy, he knew exactly what was going on. He ran at them and he barked, right? He barked ferociously and they ran. It was so, so great. And they never came for us again. Don't give bullied kids more lunch money. Give them guard dogs. Not attack dogs, but protectors. All right? And we've got a lot of ideas in the book about what those protectors might look like. And we can get some inspiration from the cultural policy too, because one of the things that it recommends that we're going to be talking about on the panel this afternoon is to extend public lending rights, which already apply to holdings of physical books in Australian libraries that get authors paid for those, extend that to digital books and audio books. Now, one of the reasons why public lending rights are so terrific is because they're not an alienable right that can be extracted. It's not lunch money that can be taken at the school gate because it's an inalienable right. The new Macquarie study over author incomes, led by my collaborator, Dr. Paul Crosby, out of Macquarie University, when they did a survey of 1,100 Australian authors, and they found that the public lending right revenue was the second most important source of revenue for Australian writers. And that's one of the big reasons why. So, second biggest source of revenue after royalties, even ahead of advances. And so that's a guard dog because it can't be taken away. It's a huge way to make a difference that will actually affect the amount of money that ends up in an author's pocket. The Revive policy also, really excitingly, suggests what if we had an award for arts workers? What if we thought seriously about minimum wages for creative workers? And that could be another guard dog as well. And we've got a whole bunch of other ones we talk about in the book. Things like transparency rights. Cory talked about Audiblegate, the way that those authors were being fleeced. You know, they were subsidizing Audible's attempts to lock subscribers into the market, and that was being hidden from them through this scam that said that they couldn't find out how many books were being returned, they could only find out their net sales. And when there was a data glitch that showed 3 weeks of returns data in a single day, that's what allowed them to find out what was going on. That's what allowed them to mobilize and resist. Because you can't fight an enemy if you don't know what it looks like. We also argue for things like improved audit rights, another way of shining light into darkness. And reversion rights, which I've spent most of the last 5 or 6 years working away on because they've got such extraordinary potential for improving the twin aims of copyright, which are to recognize and reward creators and to ensure the widest possible access to knowledge and culture. Because when creators can get their rights back and decide afresh how they want them to be exploited, that can only be good for access. And so that's what we've been doing with the Untapped project, for example, which some of you have heard me talk about before, where we republished 161 formerly out of print Australian books, really culturally important titles, including 6 winners of the Miles Franklin, books by really important women writers, First Nation writers. We did think that that would be a digital-only collection, and we were really rapt about that and excited that that meant that they would be collected under the National Library's e-deposit scheme, that we would have rescued them for as long as we've got libraries, which hopefully is a very long time, or at least until we get to near the end. But it ended up being such a strong collection of books that had all gone out of print, but the authors all wanted them back and were all interested in making them available again, that we managed to sell the print rights to. And in just the last couple of weeks, all of these books have come out again in print, which is just such an exciting thing. So yes, and they look amazing. They've all got their own new covers. And if you're here from a library, please tell your collection staff, because we'd love to see support for these collections, which all have really important books from local writers from each state and territory in them. And if you're an individual, yes, look at getting them and ask your local bookstore to get them in. But freeing up rights, unused rights for new use, that's a fantastic initiative to help authors and to help access. But I would say, like, go further than that. Like, obviously, anything that frees up creator time and energy can only be good for access. Because one of the reasons why the fight is so vicious is because the stakes are so low. Like, because we're all fighting for those crumbs. Yeah? Because there's so little to go around. And I'm sure, creators would be much less concerned about libraries lending ebooks or folks making memes if they were sharing more fairly in the rewards from their work. And I don't think that fair use would have become such a bogeyman either. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and with the benefit of hindsight, I can see places where those of us that have argued passionately for fair use have made mistakes, miscalculations about how we've gone about that. And I've been thinking about this a lot because the government's saying we're going back to the table. And I've been asking myself, how do we make things different this time? And I think our biggest mistake was to rely on the evidence. We knew, okay, because we looked into this, we cared deeply about this, we knew from our international treaty obligations, from experience in other countries that had enacted flexible exceptions, and from jurisprudence here, that the sky wasn't going to fall, right? That this was not going to decimate creators' incomes, that it was going to fix some of the biggest inefficiencies and abuses and problems of the current purpose-based ceiling, but it was by no means ever going to be the free-for-all that creators were told it was going to be. Right? But we weren't listening hard enough. Yes, a lot of the fear campaign around fair use came from big businesses that also knew better. But the reason why it was amplified by the individual creators whose voices were really powerful and influential is because they were afraid. They are afraid. Right? Most of us here, even those of us working in arts jobs, and there's a lot to be said about exploitation there and salaries in those areas, those in public service jobs feeling that we're not keeping pace with inflation, we at least have regular salaries in many cases. We have superannuation payments, right? We haven't had 10 years or more of feeling the revenue slowly drying up, not being able to get paid on your invoices, not knowing where your rent is coming from. And I think we perhaps had too intellectual an understanding of the precariousness of so much arts work rather than an embodied emotional one of what it feels like. And when you've got an insecure salary like that and you feel it slipping away and the prices for everything else keep rising and you can't afford to live in your place with your people anymore, of course you're terrified of anything that might conceivably make it still less. And in those circumstances, a change to flexible exceptions, especially when it's accompanied by people who ought to know better telling you it's going to mean the end for you, is going to scare the shit out of you. And so what do we do now? Well, as we swing back into the exceptions reform debate, one thing I want us to think about is advocating for safeguards, right? I genuinely believe, and with good reason, the sky is not going to fall, and that the things that are part of the SCARE campaign are absolutely unfounded. And I know a lot of you do too. The Australian Law Reform Commission believes that as a result of all the evidence that was provided. The Productivity Commission reached the same conclusion, right? Experience in other cases tells us that that's the case. So if we're so sure, there's no harm at all in asking for guardrails, right? Let's think more creatively about what kind of reassurances we can give, what kind of guarantees can come with reform that we know is going to improve so much for so many people, so that we can say, we hear you, and we're listening, and here's the response. Here's a meaningful response. What measures can we put in place to ensure that there won't be decimation of livelihoods? All right, so while we mull on that, over to Cory one last time to say a little bit more about how we fix stuff.
Sure, so our book, the second half of it is really just full of detailed technical proposals. We're operating on the assumption that because anything that can't go on forever will eventually stop, that we will continue in the arts to lurch from crisis to crisis. And if we can start to infuse the debate with detailed technical ideas for what to do when the crisis arises, then maybe instead of reaching for what we did last time but trying it harder, we'll try something new. And I'm quite proud of that section. We have heard from readers that the first half of the book is such a detailed dissection of such manifestly unfair proposals that they're sort of wrist-slittingly depressed by the time they get to the second session. And if you find yourself reading the book and you hear a high-pitched sound you think might be an incipient rage aneurysm, I urge you to continue reading for that second half and its shovel-ready proposals for building countervailing power, for increasing competition, and for directly regulating buyer power. But beyond the stuff that's in the book, I want to talk about a few things I've been thinking about lately. And in fact, literally two things, two principles that we can use to evaluate proposals for intermediary regulation and copyright rules in a digital world where we're trying to make platforms behave themselves, where we're trying to come up with the kind of intermediaries that we want, intermediaries that are helpmeets and who are proportionately compensated based on what they contribute, and not the intermediaries that use their position to take all the value from investors and from creative workers. And the first of those is an idea that I borrowed from the early internet wars. In fact, the first internet war the bellheads versus netheads debate, which was back when you had telecoms industry dominated by what was called circuit switching, which you're familiar with. You pick up your old rotary dial phone, you ring a number, and it connects you to someone else with a dedicated connection. And that was the bellhead model. It was a model that allowed firms to control all the value in the network. You may remember when caller ID was first introduced that lets you see who was calling you before you picked up the handset, and your carrier charged like $1.99 a month to find out who was calling you. Once the value was pushed to the edge of the network, once there was a lot of competition, that went by the wayside. You know, nobody proposes, even in these bizarre and monopolized times, nobody proposes that before you open the email message, if you want to know who it's from, you should have to pay $1.99. Today we get caller ID for free, not just on our phones, but in all of our services. You can see who's messaging you first. And that was the nethead version. It was packet switched, and it believed that we could move the communications to the edges of the network. And it was grounded in something called the end-to-end principle, which was the idea that if one machine wanted to send a packet to another machine and that other machine wanted to receive it, that no one in the middle should be able to stop it, irrespective of the protocol, irrespective of the identity of the users. And this is what gave us kind of the early internet. It created an enormous and creative foment because it really did let anyone who had a good idea and anyone who thought that it was a good idea talk to one another. It was a very free and open time. It wasn't without its problems, but I think on balance, it was well received. It became the basis, the end-to-end principle, of fights over things like network neutrality, which after all is just the idea that if you request a stream from someone else or a packet or an email, that your ISP shouldn't slow it down because that person didn't pay a bribe to reach you. That you as the customer of the ISP should be the one that determines what you're getting, not the ISP's business managers. There's no reason that you should arrange your affairs to the convenience of their shareholders. You should be primary in that relationship. So today, end-to-end is all but dead at the service level. It is very hard for a creative worker or a publisher to reach an audience member, even if that audience member asks to get messages from them. And this is true up and down the stack, and it's true across all the different platforms. And so I propose this idea as a kind of pole star for how we think about our policies, with that end-to-end should be enshrined in them. That whenever we think about regulating intermediaries, we want to make sure that one of their duties is that where you have a willing listener and a willing speaker, that the things that the one says should reach the other. So we just had one of these unbelievably stupid culture war debates in the American Congress. I'm from Canada. I recently became an American citizen for my sins. People say, why did you do that? And I say, if there was ever a time when living in America you wanted to have all the rights accruing to a citizen and not the smaller set accruing to an immigrant, this is that time. So I became an American citizen. And we had one of these absurd debates about whether Google should be obliged to not mark as spam unsolicited fundraising emails from politicians. Right? This is a very dumb debate. But what we missed was the chance to have a much smarter debate, which is the debate about whether when a constituent of a politician asks to hear from them, and Google marks that message as spam, and the person drags it out of their spam folder, whether Google should be implementing a feature that says, whenever someone says to you, this sender is not a spammer, that they should honor that request in the future, and those messages should never be marked as spam. It's a much more profound and simple thing, and in a world in which people had this brief moment where they thought, hey, maybe newsletters are a way to get a creative income, only to discover that unless your newsletter company has an arrangement with Google, every newsletter you send is going to go into spam and cease to generate revenue for you. This would be a relatively easy policy lift. We could see this on Amazon. If you're an Amazon seller, and someone searches for your product, that should be the product at the top of the results. Likewise at Google. Likewise at Spotify. If you search on Spotify for an album, Spotify will mostly give you playlists with the same name as the album that has most of the same tracks as the album, maybe all of them, but also some other tracks that they've sold positions on, right, so that they can monetize it. And if you bookmark that playlist and go back to it, it will gradually have fewer of the tracks that you asked to hear and more of the tracks that they can generate revenue from. Enshittification in a nutshell. So the thing about the end-to-end principle is that it is eminently administratable, and the compliance burdens are low and will not create capital moats. So you may remember such intermediary fights as mandatory copyright filters, which came to Europe in the Digital Single Markets Directive in 2019, the dread Article 13, which said that if you were going to have a forum in which the public could talk to other members of the public, that you would be obliged to stand up some kind of fuzzy logic filter that anyone could submit a work to and say, I assert a copyright in this work, and if something seemed to match that, it wouldn't be transmitted from the sender to the receiver. Now, Google has actually built something like this. It's called Content ID for YouTube. It does about 10% of what Article 13 proposed. It cost them $100 million. No wonder, at the end of that debate, YouTube switched sides and started calling for copyright filters. Because for them, it's not a capital moat. They've already got the sunk cost. But for everyone else who might do to YouTube, what YouTube did to every single video sharing site when they came along in 2006, $100 million is an extinction level event. Administering the copyright filter, it's not just that it's got a compliance problem, it's got an administratability problem. If you upload something and something's a close match and it doesn't get blocked, is that because Google is just dragging its feet, trying it on? Or is it because the algorithm is as good as it gets and you can't know otherwise? This is the kind of fact-intensive question you could spend a decade resolving, by which point it's a dead letter. On the other hand, did I send an email to you that you asked to receive and then you got it? That is an easily administratable question to resolve. When I search for a product on Amazon, is that what I saw? When I subscribe to someone's feed on YouTube or TikTok, did I see the videos that they posted or the videos that Google shareholders or TikTok shareholders would prefer that I could see? That's a really easy thing to administer, and in terms of the compliance burden, anyone can meet it. You know, if you're someone who's just stood up a Mastodon server for 10 of your mates, right, which is a means by which we could see artists producing material that could be federated across the whole internet without being captured by Silicon Valley billionaires. If you're running one of those servers, built into Mastodon is a thing where with one click you export all the people who follow you, and with another click you export all the people you follow, and when you go to another Mastodon server, one click uploads each of those, and then you're back up in business. We could say to everyone who runs a Mastodon server, not that they have an obligation to police lawful but awful content, as we see in Germany with the NetzDG, not that they have an obligation to police copyright, which is something that is beyond the bounds of an individual hosting some friends to ever manage, but we could say, you are obliged, if you kick someone off the server, or if you shut down and change your mind as part of our overall data protection rules, you have to provide them with those files so they can go somewhere else and not lose the audience, not lose the social connections, not lose the things that matter to them. Eminently administratable. And this is a live issue. You may have noticed that there's a whole fight about this new Harry Potter video game. And one of the ways that people are expressing their dissatisfaction with J.K. Rowling's views on gender is that they are spoiling the video game. They're telling people what the secrets are of the video game. One Mastodon administrator, a volunteer hosting 15,000 people, because it's cheap as anything to host a Mastodon server, got so angry that he turned off his Mastodon server permanently over these spoilers. Now, you know what? It's his prerogative. He was hosting something for strangers out of the goodness of his heart. He didn't like what they were doing. And I don't think that we should say to you, once you provide a Mastodon server, you can never turn it off. That's a terrible rule. But I think that it's really easy to say, hey, mate, you're going to have to email everyone when you shut down the server with their data so that they can go somewhere else and be back in business. So this is the kind of thing that allows you, if you're on a server where you don't like the definition of harassment that the person who runs the server has arrived at, and you find that you're being attacked by other users, you can leave, right? You can leave. Rather than trying to perfect people who run servers, rather than pursuing this campaign that we've had, to not say nobody should be the unelected social media czar for life of 3 billion people, we've said, oh no, we just got the wrong Mark Zuckerberg. We'll just find a better one and bind them with rules about how you have to perform if you are a good Mark Zuckerberg. We should have rules that abolish Mark Zuckerberg, not rules that perfect him, right? And the way that we get there is not by making sure that if you land on Mark Zuckerberg's platform that nothing bad happens to you, but rather if something bad happens to you on Mark Zuckerberg's platform, you can go somewhere else very easily. So that's the first principle, the end-to-end principle. And the second principle is the idea that you should be able to leave, the right of exit, right? So this is the idea that if you quit a platform, if you quit Audible, you should be able to take your books with you. If you quit Kindle, you should be able to take your books with you. If you quit YouTube and you're a performer with 3 million subscribers, there should be an interoperability layer that lets you go to another service, maybe a federated one, maybe it's TikTok, maybe it's a new worker co-op, and that those people should be able to continue to subscribe to your videos. This is something that we've had at the technological layer since Aaron Swartz was working on RSS when he was staying in my apartment when he was 13 years old. It's not the technical challenge that stands in the way, it's the business model challenge. And again, this is a highly administratable remedy. How do you know whether or not someone can leave YouTube and take their audience with them? You check. If I leave YouTube and my audience can't see my videos anymore, then YouTube's having a laugh, and we can enforce against them. The fact intensivity is very light, and the compliance burden is very light too, because we already have standards for this. All we have to say is that if you're developing a new service or if you're operating an existing one, you have to adhere to existing standards. As an author, if I quit Audible, maybe you don't want to tangle with the U.S. trade representative again and try and repeal your anti-circumvention rules that would allow me to authorize my audience to remove the DRM from the audiobooks so they could take them to a rival service. But maybe we could order Audible to convey a voucher to allow them to get any audiobook that they've bought on Audible on a rival service with permission from the rights holder. Again, it's a very easy to administer, very easy to comply with rule, and it would mean that if you wanted to leave Audible as a performer, you wouldn't have to worry that your audience would have to forfeit every dollar they've spent on your books to follow you somewhere else. So that's the idea here, right? That we can break free from this paradigm of perfecting tech companies and instead minimizing the harm they do so that we can have the benefit that we got from end to end, of having lots of approaches, of having unexpected successes. You know, the story of two guys in a garage, it's a problematic one. They're usually white guys. They've usually got rich parents. But it's not entirely wrong to say that the internet allows people to project their will for good and bad all around the world in ways that can profoundly change people's lives for good and bad. And we don't want to lose the good part. And this is a way by which we could pluralize power on the internet and make sure that we're not just reliant on the goodwill of people who, after all, are no better than you and me. And I don't know about you, but I'm just one of those ordinary mediocrities that has bad days too. And so the last thing I would want is for someone else to have to do everything I said. And so making sure that people have the right of exit and the right to reach the people who want to hear from them would go a long way to resolving a lot of the problems that we've had.
Thank you, Cory. You see, this was not a bad lifeline to the outside world for the 2 years I was locked in my apartment. I feel very lucky. We have a friend, Jamie Boyle, who tells a parable about the birth of the ecology movement. It used to be that environmental causes were fragmented into thousands of individual issues. There were the people who cared about endangered owls and the people who cared about the ozone layer, but those causes weren't recognizably part of the same issue. Right? Those people care about charismatic nocturnal avians, these guys, the chemical composition of the upper atmosphere. Right? How is that the same thing? And that coining of the term ecology made people understand that it is, that they were all fighting for the same cause. And so we also need a movement here. We need a movement because we are part of the same fight. That it's in the interests of all of us here to help creators get a better deal, and it's in creators' interest to ensure that there are vibrant and workable schools and universities and galleries and museums and libraries. Okay, because we need each other. We are also part of an ecosystem. And when we recognize that we are part of the same fight, it opens potential for new coalitions and new conversations. And I'm sure that those of us who work in the library space at least have noticed that the way in which, under the stewardship of people like Suma Karika and Margaret Allen, even the work we've been doing on Untapped, and forming new coalitions, new conversations and partnerships with people like the Australian Society of Authors and the Publishers Association, we have been managing to change those conversations by finding common understanding. And so I suppose what we're ending with here is a call to action, both for thinking about this as not something that we need to change individually, right? And in fact, that individual changes can really distract us from the need for structural and systemic ones. I mean, how many of us are still wincing as we put our soft plastics into the regular garbage bin, right? But for years, right, when we were sorting them all out and rinsing them off and drying them and putting them in the special bag that we trotted off to the special deposit and feeling very virtuous about that, only to have them being shipped halfway across the world to be buried in landfill, think of the energy that we wasted and how far behind we are compared to if we had years ago said, this is not good enough, and insisted that our policymakers not rely on an illusory market solution, but actually insist, get the incentives right, price in the real costs of this environmental destruction, and packaging makers would have had huge innovations, right? We'd be so much further ahead of where we are now. Okay, so we want to stop washing our soft plastics, metaphorically, and we want to demand real change. And we need to recognize that we have this shared mission and this shared opponent. And the shared opponent is the people, and indeed the entire economic structure, that sets out to systematically separate the people that make things and provide services from the value that results from that. And so we're going to end on a call to action. This is such an exciting time to be coming back to these questions, right? I have been fatigued for a long time, but now I am energized. Revive is an amazing step in the right direction. We've got a government at work. I would encourage those of us who have the ability to do so as individuals, and you're not tied up under public service arrangements, to send an email to the Attorney General's Department and encourage them to look at not only, and while you're at it, flick one to Tony Burke's department too, why not? Encourage them to look not only at an enforcement review that's based on what happens when copyrights are infringed, but the ability of creators to actually meaningfully enforce their rights against intermediaries. Let's look at transparency rights, let's look at reversion rights, let's look at how we actually make things better. Thank you so much. Actually, I haven't sat down, but now we've got some questions, don't we, Sarah? Do you want me to stand up here and sort of facilitate that? Is that?
If you'd like, I can run around.
And there were some mics running around. All right. Well, we have, still 10, 15 minutes, I think, for questions. Is that right?
Yep.
All right. Fantastic. We would love to hear from folks, and really as well, maybe some discussion also about what practical things we can do next. Is there one more mic, or are there just those two? Yeah, maybe Cory.
Thank you so much. And having heard a lot of the grimness last night, it's really fantastic to have had some solutions discussed here. I think it was at this forum many years ago, I don't know exactly when, where someone said one of the biggest issues we have, that copyright is both arcane and controversial. And it seems to me the communication of the significance of the proposals you're putting forward to people who, for whom this is not their bread and butter, is one of the critical things. We can all agree to cooperate in this, but and I think a collaborative approach is the only way to go forward. How do we communicate, or do you have any ideas on how we can communicate better that this type of solution is one that's going to work for everyone who's a player in that creative market, including the glam sector and authors, musicians, composers, everyone?
It is so tricky. Cory keeps saying in all of the the events we do and interviews, he's just like, we've got detailed, shovel-ready, eye-wateringly detailed solutions to like these copyright questions. I'm like, stop saying that. It sounds so boring. Like, nobody's going to read it if you describe it that way because it's not sexy, right? It isn't. But Cory, what do you think the answer is?
So I think that there is a real crisis right now in that the messaging we've had on copyright has been almost a counsel of despair. Like, look, I make my living writing. Right? I've written more than 20 books. As you've heard, I've got 7 more in production. And I need some framework for regulating my industrial relations with my supply chain. But it makes no sense that that framework should regulate how my customers relate to me. I'm all for finance regulation. It would be great if we had some. And it would be, interesting to say, like, when $1 million changes hands, you're a bank, irrespective of whether you've got some marble pillars out front and you've got to go do some bank-like stuff. But if the next day we had hyperinflation and a toasty cost $1 million, buying a toasty for a friend wouldn't make you a bank, and applying finance regulation to it wouldn't make any sense. The proxy we use for whether you're in my supply chain is whether you're making or handling copies of my work. And when there were printing presses involved, that made a lot of sense, right? The overlap between people who had printing presses and the people who were in the publishing industry was very high. The overlap between people who make and handle copies of creative works and people who are industrial actors is very low. So I live in Burbank, California, butt of many jokes. We have 3 major studios, Disney, Warner, and Universal, and a couple of kilometers from my house is the Warner studio, and 3 kilometers is the Universal studio. And when Universal built their quite excellent Harry Potter theme park, a lawyer from one called the lawyer from the other, they negotiated a deal using copyright in a highly technical way. Every Halloween, children in my neighborhood ring my doorbell in Harry Potter robes. I guarantee you some of them are writing fanfic. And living as they do in the shadow of the Warner lot, even they can't go ring the doorbell and say, I'd like to speak to a lawyer about taking a license for my fanfic, right? So we need to have some coherence here. Like, it's not weird that people don't care about copyright. They shouldn't have to care about copyright, just like you shouldn't have to understand generally accepted accounting practices to file your taxes or balance your checkbook. But you should if you're the CFO of a listed company. What we've told people as a kind of first approximation is if you're paying for the work, you're probably on the right side. So many of us rushed out and signed up for Spotify, only to hear over and over again that Spotify's not paying the artists, right? That you aren't doing the right thing anymore. And it creates a kind of nihilism where people are like, I did the right thing and that didn't work. I did the wrong thing and that didn't work. I guess nothing works, right? I think that when we take a step back from copyright per se as the system that regulates our relationship, and we take a kind of whole of law, whole of government approach to the industrial relations within all labor supply chains, and we say things like certain contracting clauses should be unconscionable. You shouldn't be able, as is now common practice, to bind people who've discovered discrepancies in their royalties and asked for payment of their stolen wages. You shouldn't be able to bind them to non-disclosure. They should be free to go tell similarly situated people where their wages have been stolen. Everybody knows that. Everybody understands that non-disclosures don't benefit other workers when they pertain to wrongdoing between you and your employer and a settlement pertaining to it. That's not a highly technical issue. As we often say with non-disclosures, they're not hiding that information from you because they know you'll be pleasantly surprised and they don't want to ruin it, right? So I think that, as eye-watering and highly technical as the solutions the second half of the book are, they do attune themselves to things that are much more relatable, right? To things that are just manifestly unfair and making them more fair. We tell stories about a labor union in my neighborhood, the Screenwriters Guild, who found that all of their work was being intermediated by 4 giant talent agencies, and the talent agencies had historically been fiduciaries. They would go negotiate the best deal they could get and take 10% of it. And they switched to a model called packaging, where they would package a star, a director, and a writer for a production, and they would take a flat fee, instead of a commission. And what this meant was that the more they negotiated for their creators, the less money was left over for their commission. And it flipped to the point where showrunners on popular shows were seeing 10% of the revenue, and their agents were getting 90%. And all 7,000 agents fired their writers in the guild fired their agents on the same day. They said, you can't do packaging fees anymore, and you must shutter the studios you've built and stop trying to build new studios where you will negotiate on our behalf with yourselves. Everybody understands why that's not good, right? And they all understand that if 7,000 workers, including the ones who aren't being adversely affected by this, but know that they could be, all stick together, that after 22 months, even with these behemoth firms owned by giant rapacious private equity funds, that you can still win. And so I think that's how you convey this. You don't make it about the industrial policy of copyright, you make it about the labor industrial policy of all workers.
Hi, Rebecca and Cory. It's lovely to be IRL in the same space as you for the second time in a week. And with everybody here, it's great for us all to be able to reconnect. I've actually got a question from the other side of my life, my non-copyright life. As a freelance arts marketing consultant kind of operating in the environment that you're talking about, I'm certainly interested in the rally call and keen to sign up, but I'm interested to know what can we do right now to address artists and arts workers' income precarity to free them to have the time to join the call?
Yeah, so in terms of right now as in today, not very much. You know, and the thing is, whenever you're dealing with a complex system, right, there's parts of it that are out of our control, and they've got different amounts of time it takes to turn the ship, right? I think that the announcement of Revive and the promise of that new money has injected, though, a feeling of hope and belief that things are going to get better, and that Australian creative workers haven't had that for a long time. So I think even just on that injection and that promise, we've already turned the attitude around as fast as we possibly can at this exact moment. And now it's about finding all of the other buttons that we can push to help ensure more money gets into the right hands. And so this is where I think creators feeling hopeful but are also listening, it's the time to tell them that we care about this stuff. And putting pressure on right now, really encouraging the government to say it's not enough to give the money, let's talk about where the money goes, and let's talk about what kind of guardrails and guard dogs that we can have, again, is going to feed into that amplify that hope, right? I think creators have felt very alone for a long time because, you know, they know they're being shaken down from every corner, and they've been told that their role is to be an individual entrepreneur with a portfolio, right? They bargain individually. Copyrights, for the most part, are individual rights. When they don't make money, they often feel individual failures. That's what I hear from creative workers. This is the time to say you're not individuals, that you are part of a class, and the government recognizing that arts work is real work and recognize arts workers as workers is a crucial part of that. And thinking about solutions that take away that individualization and that promote solidarity, but also give inalienable rights that can't be individually bargained away is going to be really critical.
I want to add one thing. You know, Australia is a land of exceptions, right? We're told that no mammals lay eggs, but they do in Australia. The other exception is that progressive governments aren't supposed to govern, right? If you win a progressive majority in Parliament, you're just supposed to hunker down and do as little as possible so that you can lose it as resoundingly as possible in the next election. Australia is like this weird, rare exception where you win progressive majorities and then you govern. This isn't a spectacular moment, right? The kind of theory of change in our book of all of those eye-watering descriptions is that as crises arise, right, there is this moment where you can stick in one of these proposals. You can try and do something other than what we've always done before. You are at an inflection point. You are actually at one of those rare moments. You know, the moment is yours to lose. You could emerge from this with an emphasis that's entirely about enforcement, which will ultimately end up being enforcement against users with intermediaries as their proxy, right? A copyright filter is a thing that just mostly binds users, right? It's just like, sorry, computer says no, you can't post your own performance of Mozart because Sony has claimed a substantially similar performance, because all performances of Mozart are substantially similar. And so you can't make a living as a music teacher because Sony is stealing your wages, which is a real thing that happens. Or it could be focused on enforcement about royalty accounting and about transparency and about fair contracting terms and about termination and reversion. All of the kind of panoply of sins. You know, we've expanded copyright for 40 years. It lasts longer. It covers more works. The statutory and exemplary damages are higher. It's easier to secure them. The industries are more profitable, and the share of income accruing to creators has fallen both in real terms and proportionally. If you can shift that, it's, I think, arguably more important than the money. The money's, you know, not nothing here. But if you can make a sustainable change, something that permanently affects the contractual relationships within that supply chain, so the distributional outcome shifts, so that more money of whatever dollars are being generated shows up in the artist's pocket instead of the intermediary's pocket, regardless of whether they're YouTube, regardless of whether they're a label, regardless of whether they're Spotify or TikTok, that's where you actually make the difference. And, you know, this is your moment to join hands with creators, user groups and creator groups, to say, like, it is in all of our benefit for as much money as we're putting into the system as possible to land in a creator's pocket.
Yeah, heck yes to that.
Just following on from these comments about the value of the artist, like, I studied liberal arts in my undergrad, and like, you could never say a more mocked sentence as a young person saying that. People are like, oh, you should learn how to say, you know, do you want fries with that, and all of that kind of thing. And so I was wondering, like, what you think about how one of the root causes of this problem is that in Western capitalism, we have the sense that artists should be starving and that they should just do it because they love it. They're not owed an income. And also we have this glorification of these companies that they are the winners, like they have made the money because they are the smartest, most brilliant geniuses in the room, and so they have won the monopsony, the game of monopsony. Yeah. And so, you know, to the winner goes the spoils. I'm just wondering what you think of those almost, and also there's sort of a left-wing, right-wing polarization there between how people feel about artists and creators and how people feel about business people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've both got things to say about this. That's a great question. Thank you so much. And Jess, I think there's the next question just there in the blue and white shirt, yeah, if you like. Okay, so let me start first of all. And do you know why people don't think artists should get paid? Because artists get to do work that doesn't leave them with a hollow emptiness inside them at the end of the day. And in the society that we live in, that feels unfair. Because we have structured things to ensure that there is a lot of bullshit jobs out there, and they are designed to make us feel that hollow emptiness. And it's a feature, not a bug, right? Because if we feel that hollow emptiness, we will fill it with ever more production and ever more consumption. And so you're cheating if you don't have it, right? And you're bypassing it, and people don't think that it's fair. And that's why, as well, that the highest paid jobs out there are for the finance bros and the people selling stuff that shouldn't exist and that nobody needs, the emptiest ones, right? You need to have lots and lots and lots of money to get people to keep doing those jobs. And even then, we all know people who were working in corporate law, but now they run their own candle business outside of their, like in their bathroom. It's really hard to keep people doing it, right? Because nobody wants to. So, like, I think that's what's going on. Cory, I'm going to turn to you because I know you got some thoughts about this as well.
So I actually agree that artists aren't especially owed a living, right? And I think one of the problems that we've had is we've said artists are especially owed a living. I think we're all owed a living, right? And I think that we can separate the question of whether there is a sustainable market-based solution for providing a full-time, comfortable, socially inclusive wage to everyone who wants to make art, which I think there isn't and probably won't be, because I think we make art in the way that, you know, ants make hills, like it's just sort of innate to the human condition. We can separate that from whether artists should starve. And one of the ways that we connect the struggles of artistic workers to other kinds of workers is to say that everyone has the right, that the benchmark for a society and an economic system and its arrangements is whether it can provide a home, nutrition, self-satisfaction, education, and all the essentials to people. And if your system isn't providing those things, this is the argument for market capitalism, right? It's supposed to produce prosperity that eventually becomes broadly shared, and the inequality is just a motivator to get people to do more things that increase more prosperity. And if it's not, right, if converting shelter to an asset class ends up leaving, like as in London, a third of the homes in Mayfair empty because there's safe deposit boxes in the sky for, you know, war criminals around the world, then your system has failed, right? It's failed on its own terms. So I think that's one of the things that we just need to stop saying, is that artists deserve a living. We need to say everybody deserves a living, including artists. And then we can add to that, look, if your art is making money, that money should be going to you, preferentially, right? That like, as a separate question from whether every artist should have an audience that's of sufficient size and motivation to make the money, whatever money is being generated with your work should preferentially end up in your trouser pocket and not in the pocket of some intermediary. And I think both of those are good principles, and neither of them are mutually exclusive.
Just the last question before morning tea. I wanted to ask about the term of copyright. So you were talking about continually giving money to the bullies and you know, the potential of this system just continuing to get worse. The term of copyright, to a degree, is arbitrary, and it tends to benefit, you know, we've ended up with the length that we have in part because of corporations. What kind of revisions could be brought into the length of copyright, and how might this benefit people throughout the chain?
Well, we think a really interesting question is to think about how the copyright term gets divided up. Because at the moment, we allow all the lunch money to be taken at point of entry, right? We've got no protections in Australia on, we call it freedom of contract, but that includes the freedom to be shaken down at the school gate for everything that you've got, including before anyone knows the value of it. So what we talk about in the book, and part of where we argue about time limits on copyright assignments, you know, already about half the countries in the world have some kind of statutory reversion right. And Josh Yuvaraj in the back here is going to be, I think, talking a little bit about reversion this afternoon. What's really interesting is to think about how we can divide those years up to do a better job of achieving both access to knowledge and getting artists paid. And so if we did say, well, okay, you can transfer your rights for, say, 25 years, which is how long all the economic modeling tells us is the maximum amount necessary to incentivize those investments in getting works produced and available, then boomerang them back to creators so that they can re-exploit them. It means that these powerful corporations don't have the ability to continue to build up these vast reservoirs of rights that they can use to continue to shape the future of the industry, because every 25 years they'll have to bargain afresh for those rights. And if the creator doesn't like the deal that they're being offered, they can give them to someone else. Or someone else can come along and say, look at this amazing new way we've got of getting works out, and they can try going with that instead, or they might exploit it themselves. So choice really helps. And we talk as well in the book about, well, what about, you know, copyright covers everything automatically, and lots of artists are interested in getting their stuff back, but lots of them have no further interest after a pretty short amount of time. And we argue that, you know, those perhaps could go under the stewardship of like a cultural steward to exploit them. They might be able to do then bulk licensing to you know, very streamlined bulk licensing to things like cultural institutions and schools and libraries, and put the money that comes from that into supporting authorship in terms of grants and prizes and fellowships. And so there's ways in which we can restructure things so that we actually make the pie bigger and we get more of what we want in terms of access and more of what we want in terms of more money to be able to put into this, if we just think about things a little bit differently. Thank you so much.
Do we have time for me to add something?
Add something.
Or if not,
Totally
if we don't, we
Totally
don't. But I mean, I think that, you know, as a practical matter, changing terms is a third rail. It's very hard to do. I think the term is too long. I think that it creates a lot of enforced death to posterity, right? It's very hard to recover works when you can't identify their owners, and we see that there's a real archiving crisis and a real reuse crisis that takes work out of circulation. Living as we do in this world, you know, as the joke from Ireland goes, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. Living in this world that we live in and trying to figure out what we can do at the margins to try and make for a better world. Rebecca, I think, has just sketched out some pretty good ones. I think in general, conceiving of rights as individual property rights that can get traded away as opposed to collective rights tends to redound to the detriment of creators. And there's a little parable here about the distinction between the right to perform a composition and the right to sample a recording of that performance. So the right to perform a composition is managed collectively by big performing rights organizations. You can take any song you want once it's been recorded once and you can perform it. This is something that comes to us from the history of music, right? Everybody who's ever learned to play music by performing other people's compositions. If you go to see a show, even from a big famous performer, they'll often perform someone else's songs, and it's a crowd pleaser. And we wanted to honor that and make that possible. Paul Anka didn't need to give permission to Sid Vicious to record My Way. Sid Vicious just paid a flat rate. You could pay that flat rate, and you could record My Way too. So this collective right turns out to be super powerful, and it's powerful for everyone in the supply chain, including the most powerful people like Taylor Swift, whose jerky ex-boyfriend and his private equity people own her masters, and were trying to bind her over to years of servitude by controlling those masters. And she left and went to another label, and she recorded covers of her own music using these licenses, right? So this is a way that we can extend them into the long term. Contrast that with sampling, right? Sampling was at first considered a thing that wasn't licensable or that you required a license for, in the same way that if you're a jazz trumpeter and you grab a couple of bars of something that's very popular in the middle of your solo and just drop it in as an homage, nobody asks you for a license for it. And then we decided, okay, this is going to be licensed and it's going to be an individual tradable property right. So at first, a few heritage acts got some one-time license fees off of this, but immediately the big three labels that control 70% of recordings said to sign up for a label, you've got to sign over your sampling rights, and to sample, you've got to sign up for a label. And so they built out these huge portfolios that gave them total control over this. And this isn't just bad news for the kind of music we make. It also extinguished a lot of music. So Tugoi the Dove, one of the founders of De La Soul, a seminal band that was very sample heavy, he just died. And he died before any of his music was cleared for streaming. Right? The first of his albums is going up in March because no one could clear those samples. Now, we don't have to say sampling should be a free-for-all. I personally think it should be, but we don't have to say it should be a free-for-all, and we don't have to say that it should be property. We could come up with a collective management system, and then we could discipline those PROs because they're another intermediary, so we could say things to them like, you've got to be transparent in the ways that we describe in the book. If you have unattributable royalty, we've heard about PROs that struggle to locate obscure artists like Beyonce to give them the money that's owed to her. If you have unattributable money, the only thing you can spend it on is improving your attribution systems. Right? It can't go to a development fund that you give to your chums. Right? All of that could strike a balance between very long terms and the needs of users, where we set a decent rate, we make sure that lots of people can use it, and the work is just never locked up, not because the creator doesn't want a deal, but because the creator can't be found.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.